The city never truly slept, but that night New York was humming with the particular kind of energy that only came after victory. Inside the Glass Ember, a high-rise bar above Madison Avenue, laughter and clinking glasses filled the air. Lawyers, paralegals, and interns from Cole & Myers LLP were celebrating another courtroom win, a multi-million-dollar settlement against one of the city's biggest pharmaceutical companies. And at the center of it all sat Ethan Cole, the man of the hour. His smile was easy, confident, the kind that came naturally to someone who knew how to win, in court, in life, in every room he walked into. His tie hung loose around his neck, his sleeves rolled up, the collar of his shirt slightly open. He looked like the archetype of a successful lawyer, brilliant, sharp, untouchable. "Ethan, tell them what you said to the jury," someone shouted over the music. Ethan laughed, shaking his head. "Oh, come on, it's not that interesting." "Oh, it is," said Dana Myers, his senior partner and one of the few people he genuinely respected. "You cornered the opposing counsel like a wolf with a scent." Ethan smirked. "I told them, if justice had a heartbeat, it would sound exactly like the truth you're afraid to tell." The table erupted in laughter and applause. Someone raised a glass. "To Ethan Cole, the heartbeat of justice!" The cheer rose loud enough to drown out the piano music. Ethan raised his own glass and drank deep. Scotch burned down his throat, familiar, comforting. The night blurred pleasantly around the edges. The golden lights, the reflection of skyscrapers in the glass, the chorus of congratulations. He didn't remember how many rounds followed. He didn't care. He only remembered the warmth of the whiskey, the dull hum of satisfaction in his chest, the way success always seemed to taste like smoke and victory. It wasn't until the crowd thinned and the lights dimmed that he realized he was alone. The bar had emptied. The city stretched endlessly below him, and his phone buzzed on the table. One new message. "Emma, you promised you'd come home before midnight." Ethan blinked. The glowing numbers on his watch read 1:37 a.m. He sighed, grabbed his keys, and headed out. Outside, the night was cool and sharp. The streets shimmered with rain that had fallen earlier, puddles reflecting neon signs and taillights. Ethan tossed his briefcase into the passenger seat of his Mercedes and started the engine. He wasn't drunk, not really. At least, that's what he told himself. He'd driven after having a few drinks before. He knew his limits. He was fine. He pulled out onto Madison Avenue, the city rushing past in streaks of color and motion. Halfway across the bridge, the world began to tilt. Not physically, but in that subtle, disorienting way when adrenaline and alcohol mix just wrong. His vision tunneled for a split second, his hands tightening on the wheel, a flash of red light, a sound like thunder. Brakes, metal, shouting. The car spun, the city whirling around him in a smear of glass and light. Then, impact. When everything stopped, there was silence. His ears rang. His breath came short. The front of his car was crumpled against the barrier. A police cruiser sat at an angle a few feet away, its headlights shattered. A figure stumbled out of it. An officer, young, shaken, but unharmed. Ethan blinked, dazed, the airbag deflating slowly against his chest. "Sir, stay in the car!" The voice was distant, echoing through the ringing in his head. Another light flashed, blue this time, blinding, as backup arrived. By the time he realized what was happening, a breathalyzer was in front of him, the officer's voice calm but firm. "Sir, have you been drinking tonight?" Ethan's heart sank. His mouth tasted of scotch. His mind, usually quick with arguments and loopholes, went blank. I had a drink, yes, but please blow into the device, sir." He did. The beep that followed sounded like a sentence being passed. The hearing came swiftly. It always did for people like him. The public wanted to see the mighty fall. Driving under the influence, property damage, endangerment of a law enforcement officer. The judge's gavel cracked through the courtroom like a hammer. His driver's license, suspended for 1 year, his law license revoked indefinitely, pending review. Dana Myers sat beside him, silent. When the sentence ended, she placed a hand on his shoulder. "Ethan," she said softly, "you'll come back from this. Just take some time. Get help." But Ethan didn't hear her. All he heard was the sound of whispers in the courtroom gallery, the reporters scribbling, the click of cameras, the faint laughter of people who had once envied him. Outside the courthouse, a light snow began to fall. It should have been beautiful. Instead, it just felt cold. 3 months later, Ethan Cole was a ghost in a borrowed uniform. The name tag on his black vest read E. Cole, though most people never bothered to look at it. They just called him Waiter. Rossi's Italian restaurant was the kind of place that smelled of truffle oil and old money. The kind where judges and politicians came to eat handmade pasta and talk about justice like it was a commodity. Ethan moved among them like a shadow. He poured wine, refilled glasses, cleared plates. He smiled when spoken to and disappeared when not. It was strange how invisible he had become. A man once feared for his cross-examinations could now stand beside the city's elite and not be seen at all. But invisibility had its uses. At night, when the restaurant closed, Ethan would stay behind to wipe tables and watch the reflection of the city lights on the wine glasses. He found something oddly meditative about it. The repetition, the quiet. Still, there were nights when his hands would stop, hovering over the tablecloth, and he'd see the courtroom again. The judge's eyes, the gavel, the faces of the jury he'd once swayed with every word. He missed it. The rhythm, the challenge, the rush of truth against deceit. But more than anything, he missed the man he used to be. One Friday evening, a large party arrived just before closing. Reservation under Reynolds. The maitre d' snapped her fingers. "Ethan, table 9, VIP guests." He nodded automatically, grabbing menus and heading to the booth near the back. When he reached it, he froze. 3 men in immaculate suits were settling in, their laughter loud, confident, familiar. Reynolds, Vance, Porter, the city's most polished predators. He knew them from another lifetime. Rival lawyers who thrived on technicalities and manipulation. The kind who treated justice like a chessboard. They didn't recognize him. Why would they? He was wearing an apron, not Armani. Ethan poured their wine silently, listening as they talked. The conversation started casually. Politics, cases, clients. But then one of them said something that made his hand tremble slightly. "Reed's done. Once the papers are switched, he won't know what hit him." Ethan's head snapped up. Reed. Jacob Reed. The name sent a rush of memory through him. A small-time contractor, falsely accused of embezzling funds from a project he barely controlled. Ethan had been his lawyer before the accident. He'd promised the man's wife that he would clear his name. Then the scandal hit, and Ethan had been stripped of everything, leaving Reed defenseless. He swallowed hard, forcing his hand steady as he poured. "And the new witness?" another voice asked. Porter's, smooth and detached. "Bought and paid for," Reynolds said. "No jury will doubt him." They laughed. It was the sound of certainty, the confidence of men who believed themselves untouchable. Ethan finished pouring the last glass, muttered, "Enjoy your evening," and walked away. But his pulse was pounding in his ears. Behind the kitchen door, he leaned against the counter, staring at the wall. His breathing came ragged. Reed was innocent. He knew it. And now, the same lawyers who built their reputations on deception were preparing to bury him alive. Something inside Ethan, something he thought had died with his career, began to stir. He waited until the end of his shift. When the restaurant emptied, he returned to table 9. On the leather seat, he found a folder one of them had forgotten. The embossed logo of Reynolds and Associates gleamed faintly under the light. He hesitated only a moment before sliding it into his apron pocket. That night in his tiny apartment, he opened it. Inside were drafts of testimony, copies of evidence, and a list of approved witnesses. At the bottom of one page, handwritten in Reynolds's careful scrawl, were the words, "Ensure Reed's guilt is irrefutable. No loose ends." Ethan stared at it until the words blurred. He had spent months punishing himself, convinced he deserved his fall. But this was something else. He might have lost his license, his reputation, his name, but he hadn't lost his sense of justice. Not yet. Outside, the city lights flickered across his window, reflections of 1,000 lives continuing as his stood still. He reached into a drawer, pulled out his old dictaphone, and pressed record. Date, February 3rd. Subject, Jacob Reed case. Possible tampering of evidence by attorneys Reynolds, Vance, and Porter. His voice was calm, steady, the voice of a man reclaiming purpose. He didn't know how far this would go. He didn't even know if he could win. But for the first time since that night on the bridge, Ethan Cole felt alive again. And as the snow began to fall outside, covering the city in a cold, perfect silence, he began planning. Not for revenge, for redemption. The next evening, Table 9 was reserved again. Ethan stood in the kitchen doorway, wiping his hands on a towel, watching as the same 3 men sat laughing over wine and steak. The noise of the restaurant faded around him until their words were all he could hear. It wasn't just arrogance. It was certainty. They believed no one would ever dare expose them. He slipped his phone into his vest pocket, screen recording. He stepped forward, refilled their glasses, and smiled just enough to stay invisible. They kept talking. "Once we get the final signature from the judge's clerk, it's over," Vance said. "Reed goes down, the client walks free," Reynolds added. Ethan's phone captured every word. He stepped back, excused himself politely, and disappeared into the kitchen. His heart raced. His mind was clear. He wasn't a lawyer anymore, but maybe he didn't need to be one to do what was right. The kitchen clock ticked toward midnight. Outside, the city glimmered like 1,000 quiet witnesses, and somewhere across town, Jacob Reed sat in a holding cell, unaware that his last hope was a man who no longer had the right to stand in a courtroom. Not yet. The night after he made the first recording, Ethan barely slept. The city outside his window hummed with that low, electric restlessness that only New York could produce. The sound of ambition grinding through concrete and insomnia. He sat at his kitchen table, staring at his phone, replaying the faint, muffled voices over and over again. Reynolds, Vance, Porter. Their laughter, their confidence, their carelessness. It wasn't much yet, but it was enough to light the fuse. His coffee had gone cold by the time dawn began to gray the skyline. He leaned back, exhaustion pulling at his eyes, but his mind was already racing ahead. He knew he needed more than recordings. The justice system didn't move for whispers. It moved for proof. Documents, witnesses, timelines. He'd spent a lifetime learning how to build a case. Now he had to do it without a badge, without a license, without a single ounce of credibility left in this city. When he left the apartment, the streets were still quiet. Delivery trucks rumbled through the early morning mist, and somewhere far above, the first streaks of sunlight hit the glass towers. Ethan pulled his coat tighter around him and walked to Rossi's. He was supposed to start the breakfast shift at 8, but he needed to get there early. Not to serve, but to hunt. The back entrance was unlocked. He slipped in through the alleyway, greeted by the smell of yeast and garlic. The kitchen was empty except for Luis, the prep cook, who barely looked up from slicing tomatoes. "Morning, Cole," Luis said without interest. "Morning," Ethan murmured, heading straight for the back office. The restaurant kept copies of every reservation, times, guests, table assignments. Ethan flipped through the ledger until he found what he needed. Table 9, Reynolds and Associates, 7:30 p.m., recurring reservation every Friday for the next month. He felt a flicker of adrenaline. That gave him time. 4 Fridays to gather enough evidence to burn them down. He closed the ledger quietly and went back to work, forcing himself into routine. By the time the restaurant opened, the mask was on again. The quiet, polite waiter, invisible and harmless. But behind his neutral smile, his mind was already drafting strategy. That night, the 3 men came again. Same table, same laughter. This time, Ethan was ready. He had tucked a small recording device beneath the booth earlier that day, wired to his phone. All he had to do was serve, smile, and let them talk. He carried their plates, ribeye for Reynolds, sea bass for Porter, pasta for Vance, and lingered just long enough to catch fragments of conversation. "You're sure the documents can't be traced?" "Completely scrubbed. Our IT guy's a ghost." "And the DA's office?" "Taken care of. They'll never even look at Reed twice." Ethan felt the old courtroom instincts returning. The parsing of words, the rhythm of deceit, the way each man revealed his guilt in the arrogance of safety. He moved like a ghost among them, unnoticed. Later that night, after the last table cleared and the lights dimmed, he retrieved the recorder. He sat in the empty dining room, playing back the faint voices, catching phrases that could bury a career. It wasn't perfect quality, but it was damning enough to keep him awake till morning. Still, he knew recordings alone wouldn't hold up. He needed someone to verify the manipulation of evidence. Someone on the inside. And there was only one name that came to mind: Nina Harris. She had been an intern once, fresh out of Columbia, too idealistic for the cynical halls of justice. Ethan had mentored her briefly, back when he was still Ethan Cole, attorney at law. He remembered her eyes, sharp, fierce, filled with that naive belief that the law could save people. He found her number buried in an old contact list. His finger hovered over it for a long time before pressing call. She answered on the second ring. "Hello?" "Nina, it's Ethan." There was a long silence. "Ethan Cole?" "Yeah." "Jesus, Ethan, I read what happened. Are you okay?" He almost laughed. "Define okay." Another pause, then quietly, "Why are you calling me?" "I need your help. It's about the Reed case." He heard the shift in her breathing. "That case was reassigned months ago. Why?" "Because he's being set up. I've heard things, Nina. I've got proof. Not enough yet, but something real. You're disbarred, Ethan. You can't—" "I know what I am," he said sharply, then softened his tone. "But you're still in the game. You can get the files, the motions, the evidence chain. I just need eyes. Please." The silence on the other end stretched, long and uncertain. Then she sighed. "Meet me tomorrow morning. Coffee shop on 82nd and Lexington. 8 o'clock. Don't make me regret this." "I won't." He hung up before he could thank her. The coffee shop was crowded, full of noise and chatter. Nina arrived in a navy trench coat, her hair tied back, dark circles under her eyes. She looked older, wearier, but her gaze still carried that same spark of conviction. She sat down without a word, ordered black coffee, and then met his eyes. "You look terrible." "Good to see you too," he said with a wry smile. "What exactly are you playing at, Ethan?" she asked quietly. "Because if this is some redemption fantasy—" "It's not," he cut in. "I'm not looking to be a hero. I just want to stop 3 snakes from poisoning a man's life." He pulled out his phone and played the recordings. Her expression changed as she listened, from disbelief to shock to cold, furious anger. "Those bastards," she murmured. "They're falsifying evidence, bribing witnesses. Everything you'd expect from them," Ethan said. "And they'll get away with it unless we move fast." She looked at him. "You know I could lose my job just for talking to you." "Yeah," he said quietly. "So could I. but maybe losing something isn't always the worst thing that can happen. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Nina pushed her cup aside. Okay, what do you need? They met in secret over the next week, piecing together a trail of deceit. Nina smuggled out copies of case files, deposition transcripts, email exchanges between the DA's office and the prosecutors. Ethan spent nights cross-referencing every line, looking for discrepancies, timelines that didn't fit, witnesses who couldn't exist. Slowly, the picture formed, a perfect illusion. The evidence against Jacob Reed had been reconstructed from doctored financial statements, altered timestamps, and fabricated witness accounts. The level of detail was staggering. Reynolds and his partners had built a false reality so convincing it could have fooled anyone, except Ethan Cole. Each night, as he and Nina worked, he felt something rekindle inside him. Not pride, not ambition. Something quieter. Purpose. There was danger, too. Twice he noticed cars idling too long outside his apartment. Once, when he returned home, his front door was slightly ajar. Nothing was taken, but a single sheet of paper sat on his kitchen table. Blank, except for 3 words scrawled in ink. Walk away, Ethan. He folded the note carefully and burned it in the sink. The following Friday, the trio returned to Rossi's again. The same laughter, the same wine. But this time, Ethan wasn't just recording them. He was baiting them. He served the table slowly, deliberately, offering small remarks. Busy week, gentlemen? You must be handling some serious cases to dine here so often. Reynolds smirked. You could say that. Let's just say justice is profitable. They laughed. Porter raised his glass. To justice. Ethan clinked their glasses without smiling. He knew every word mattered, every offhand comment, every arrogant toast. It all became part of the tapestry of guilt. Later, when he and Nina met again in her car parked under the overpass, he handed her the recordings and a thick folder. This is everything so far, he said. Enough to force an internal review. She hesitated. And if they trace it back to you? Then they'll see what they made me, he said simply. She looked at him. Really looked. And for the first time, she seemed to understand. You can't walk into court, Ethan, she said softly. You'll be arrested for even showing up. He smiled faintly. Then I won't walk in as myself. By the end of the month, the case was heading for trial. The city buzzed with gossip, a high-profile embezzlement, a poor man accused of stealing from giants. It was spectacle, and Reynolds thrived on spectacle. Ethan watched from the sidelines as Nina prepared. Her opening statements were sharp, her motions precise, but he could see the fear in her eyes. She was going up against men who had rewritten the rules. The night before the hearing, Ethan showed up at her apartment with a briefcase. I can't officially represent Reed, he said, but I can stand beside you, just as a consultant. That's illegal, she said flatly. So is what they're doing. She stared at him, torn between fear and belief. Then finally she nodded. The next morning, Ethan wore a plain gray suit and a borrowed ID badge that read, Paralegal Assistant. No one questioned him. He walked into the courthouse with the same calm confidence he once carried as a licensed attorney, though this time, every step felt like trespassing on holy ground. Inside, he sat beside Nina and Reed at the defense table. Jacob Reed looked thinner, older, broken by months of accusation. When his eyes met Ethan's, confusion flickered. You're my old lawyer. Just helping out, Ethan whispered. We're going to fix this. The bailiff called the court to order. The prosecution entered, led by Reynolds, perfectly pressed and smug as ever. His eyes swept over Ethan, unrecognizing, dismissive. And for the first time, Ethan felt the faint thrill of power again, the kind that came not from authority, but from purpose. When the first witness was called, he leaned toward Nina, whispering, Ask about his meeting on the 12th. She did. The witness stumbled, hesitated. Ethan's pulse quickened. It was beginning. The trial would last weeks, but that first day, that first clash, reignited everything Ethan had lost, and everything he was willing to risk to get it back. The courtroom's air was electric. Every objection, every glance was a duel of wills. And as he sat there, half in shadow, pretending to be someone he wasn't, Ethan Cole felt a strange peace settle over him. He had fallen from grace. Now he was walking through the ashes, building something new, something honest. The courtroom was a theater of tension, every breath measured, every sound amplified. The smell of polished wood, paper, and anticipation lingered in the air like the aftermath of a storm. Ethan sat quietly at the defense table beside Nina, his hands folded, his expression unreadable. The gray suit he wore, borrowed, slightly tight at the shoulders, made him blend in just enough to avoid suspicion. To anyone watching, he was simply a paralegal, assisting a young public defender in an impossible case. But to Ethan, this was something sacred. It was his altar, his battlefield, his redemption waiting to be written in ink and sweat and truth. Across the aisle, Reynolds and his team lounged like predators at rest. Every line of their posture screamed confidence. They had the evidence, the witnesses, the money. They had the jury's sympathy before the first word was even spoken. Ethan could feel Reynolds' gaze sweep the room like a man surveying property he already owned. The bailiff called the court to order. The sound of the gavel cracked like a gunshot. "All rise." Judge Horowitz entered, tall, gray-haired, with a gaze that could strip arrogance from any attorney. Ethan had argued cases before him years ago. The man's reputation was for fairness, but also impatience. He disliked games. He demanded precision. Nina stood to deliver her opening statement, her voice trembling slightly at first, then growing stronger with each word. "Jacob Reed is not a thief," she began. "He is a man caught in a web spun by those who believe power and money can rewrite the truth." Reynolds leaned back, lips curling into a smirk. Ethan noticed it but said nothing. He could feel the tremor in Nina's hand under the table, saw the flash of uncertainty when the prosecution objected for the first time. Leading argument. She faltered but recovered. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And honesty, Ethan thought, had a way of unsettling those who lived by lies. The prosecution's turn came next. Reynolds rose, every movement rehearsed. He was magnificent, in a way only the corrupt could be. Confident, theatrical, charming. He painted Jacob Reed as a desperate man, driven by greed. He spoke of missing funds, falsified invoices, and betrayal. He turned the jury's sympathy with practiced ease, and when he finished, the silence in the room was heavy. Ethan leaned toward Nina. "He's good," he whispered. She nodded grimly. "Too good." The first witness was called, a company accountant named Baxter, middle-aged, nervous, and clearly rehearsed. He claimed he'd seen Reed alter financial records late at night, that he'd found traces of the missing money in Reed's personal account. The evidence projected onto the screen behind them seemed airtight, but Ethan saw it immediately. The timestamps, the metadata, the formatting of the files, too clean, too perfect. "Ask to see the metadata log," he whispered. Nina hesitated, then did as he said. "Objection!" Reynolds barked instantly. "Irrelevant. The documents have already been verified." Ethan's lips twitched. Predictable. "Your Honor," Nina countered, her voice steadier now, "we have reason to believe these documents may have been tampered with. The metadata will show when and where they were last modified." Judge Horowitz considered, tapping his pen against the desk. "Objection overruled. The defense may proceed." Baxter fidgeted. The screen displayed the log. And there it was. A modification timestamp that didn't match the supposed upload date. The jury stirred. Ethan caught Reynolds' expression. A flicker, a flash of annoyance quickly buried under his mask of calm. That was the first crack. Small, but real. During the recess, Nina slumped against the defense table, exhausted. "That was close," she muttered. "He's not going to underestimate us again." Ethan smiled faintly. "Good. Let him get angry. Anger makes smart men stupid." She looked at him for a moment, studying his face. "You miss it, don't you? The game." He met her eyes. "It's not a game, Nina. Not when people's lives are on the board." They ate lunch in silence. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded the steps, calling out questions. "Is it true the defense found new evidence? Is Jacob Reed cooperating with the DA?" Cameras flashed. Nina kept her head down. Ethan stayed in the shadows. He couldn't afford recognition. Not yet. When they returned for the afternoon session, Reynolds had recalibrated. His team presented new testimony, each more polished than the last. Witness after witness came forward, painting Reed as deceitful, calculating, guilty. By the third witness, the tide seemed to be turning again. The jurors' eyes grew colder. Ethan felt the pressure building, the helplessness, the same bitter taste he'd known when he'd lost his license, when everything he said no longer mattered. Then, something in him snapped. He scribbled a note on a yellow legal pad and slid it to Nina. "Ask who prepared the witness for testimony." She glanced at him, confused, but obeyed. The witness blinked. Mr. Reynolds' office, I believe? And how many times did you meet before today?" 4, maybe 5? "And were you told what to say?" "Objection!" Reynolds thundered. "Badgering the witness!" "Sustained," said the judge, but the seed was planted. The witness looked shaken, and the jury noticed. That night, back in his apartment, Ethan couldn't sleep. The ceiling above him pulsed with the hum of city life, but his mind was elsewhere, in the courtroom, in the flicker of the jury's eyes, in the tiny moments of doubt beginning to surface. He poured himself a glass of water, stared at his reflection in the window. "You're not supposed to be there," he murmured to himself. "You're not supposed to exist anymore." But he did. And as long as he did, he wouldn't stop. The next day brought chaos. Someone had leaked a story to the press. Disgraced lawyer cited at high-profile trial. It was small, speculative, but dangerous. If the judge saw it, everything would crumble. Nina confronted him in the courthouse hallway. "Ethan, what did you do?" "Nothing," he said. "Someone's digging." "Then you need to stay out of sight. Let me handle the rest." "You can't. Not alone." Her jaw tightened. "You think I can't fight them?" "I think they've been playing this game longer than you've been alive." She stared at him, anger flashing in her eyes, and behind it, fear. "Then tell me what to do, damn it." He handed her a USB drive. "Play this when they bring up the final witness." "What is it?" "Insurance." The following morning, the courtroom was a storm barely contained by walls. Reporters packed the benches, cameras clicked like gunfire, and the tension was suffocating. Reynolds looked like a man ready to claim his victory. He called his final witness, a so-called forensic analyst, an expert who could prove the embezzlement trail beyond a shadow of doubt. Ethan's jaw clenched. He recognized the man. He wasn't an analyst, he was a contractor Reynolds used for dirty work, falsifying data, deleting evidence, making the impossible look legitimate. Nina stood slowly, every eye on her. "Your Honor, before the witness proceeds, the defense has supplemental evidence to submit." Reynolds stiffened. "On what grounds?" "On the grounds of truth." The clerk inserted the USB into the court system. The audio began to play. 3 voices, crisp and unmistakable. "Reed doesn't know what's coming. The witness is bought and paid for. Make sure the data looks clean. The courtroom exploded. Shouts, gasps, reporters lunging forward. Judge Horowitz pounded the gavel, demanding order. Reynolds rose, his composure cracking. "This is outrageous. That recording is inadmissible." Ethan stood, his heart hammering, voice clear and calm. "Maybe, but it's real." Every head turned. The judge's eyes narrowed. "Who are you, sir?" Ethan hesitated only a heartbeat. "My name is Ethan Cole. I was once an attorney. I represented Jacob Reed before I was stripped of my license, but I couldn't stand by and watch this corruption destroy another innocent man." The room fell into stunned silence. Horowitz's expression was unreadable. "You realize what you've done, Mr. Cole?" "Yes, Your Honor," Ethan said quietly. "I broke the rules to uphold the law." Security moved forward, but the judge lifted a hand. "Not yet." He turned to the prosecution. "Mr. Reynolds, I suggest you explain this recording, unless you'd prefer I forward it directly to the district attorney for investigation." Reynolds's face went pale. Ethan could almost see the empire of deceit collapsing behind those cold eyes. The judge adjourned the hearing for the day. Reporters flooded the hallway, shouting questions. Ethan didn't answer any of them. He walked past the flashing lights like a man moving through a storm, unshaken. Nina caught up with him on the courthouse steps. "They'll come for you," she said, her voice trembling. "I know. But you did it." He smiled faintly. "No, we did." For a moment, neither spoke. Then she asked, almost in a whisper, "What happens now?" Ethan looked out at the city, the cold wind cutting across his face. "Now?" he said. "Now the real trial begins." That night he returned to his apartment. The silence felt heavier than usual. His phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. "You should have stayed down." He closed the phone, slid it into his drawer, and looked out the window. Somewhere below, in the veins of the city, the corrupt and the powerful were already moving, calculating their next move. He knew this wasn't over. Exposing Reynolds had lit a fire, one that would burn far beyond the courtroom. He turned off the lights, the city still glowing beyond the glass. His reflection stared back at him, tired, battered, but alive. Tomorrow, the headlines would break. The scandal would spread. The system would stir uncomfortably, and Ethan Cole would have to decide whether redemption was worth the price it demanded. The snow began to fall again, quiet and endless, covering the city in white. He watched it drift past the streetlights until the edges of his vision blurred. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a ghost anymore. He felt human, flawed, fragile, but fighting. He whispered to himself, almost a prayer, "Let the truth win, just once." Outside, the sirens wailed somewhere distant, like a promise and a warning all at once. Morning arrived with the uneasy quiet that follows a storm. The headlines had already done their damage. Disgraced ex-lawyer exposes corruption in courtroom scandal. Justice or vendetta? The Ethan Cole affair. By 8 o'clock, his name was on every news ticker in Manhattan. By 9, his phone was filled with messages, some praising him as a hero, others calling for his arrest. Ethan stared at the television screen from the corner of his apartment, the blue light flickering across his face. The anchor's voice carried that rehearsed blend of awe and suspicion. Former attorney Ethan Cole, who was disbarred last year following a DUI incident, has emerged at the center of a high-profile corruption scandal. Sources say his evidence led to the suspension of 3 prosecutors pending investigation. He muted the TV, exhaling slowly. The city outside still moved, cabs honking, people shouting, life continuing as though justice itself hadn't just cracked open. A knock came at the door, sharp, urgent. He froze. 3 knocks, then silence. "Mr. Cole?" A woman's voice, calm but firm. "It's Nina." He opened the door. She stepped in quickly, pulling off her gloves. Her face was pale, eyes wide with exhaustion. "They're coming after you," she said without preamble. "The Bar Association, the DA's office, everyone." He smiled faintly. That didn't take long. "I mean it, Ethan. You've humiliated some very powerful people. They won't stop at your license this time." He poured her coffee, setting the cup on the table. "Then they'll have to find me first." "This isn't a movie," she snapped. "They don't need to find you. They'll bury you in paperwork, legal threats, and headlines. They'll destroy whatever's left of your life." He looked at her, the tremor in her hands, the fire in her eyes. "You could walk away, Nina. You've done your part." She shook her head. "You think I'd sleep at night knowing I let them win again?" For a long moment, neither spoke. The air between them buzzed with quiet defiance. Finally, Ethan said, "Then we do it properly. We finish it." By afternoon, the courthouse was swarming with reporters. The DA had ordered an emergency review of every case handled by Reynolds, Vance, and Porter. It was chaos, the kind that made bureaucrats nervous and journalists hungry. Inside, Judge Horowitz convened a closed session. Only essential personnel were allowed in. Ethan wasn't one of them. He waited in the hallway, pacing. His palms were slick with sweat. Each tick of the clock echoed like a heartbeat. At last, the door opened. Horowitz emerged, his expression carved from stone. "Mr. Cole," he said. "A word." Ethan straightened. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge gestured toward an empty bench. "You realize the gravity of what you've done?" "I do." "You entered my courtroom under false pretenses. You violated the terms of your disbarment. You presented evidence obtained without warrant." "Yes," Ethan said evenly. "And I also prevented 3 corrupt lawyers from sending an innocent man to prison." Horowitz studied him in silence. Behind that stern mask, there was something like reluctant respect. "You're lucky the truth supports your cause," the judge said finally. "But luck doesn't erase consequence. There will be hearings. You may face charges." "I understand." The judge sighed, weary. "You have a dangerous sense of justice, Mr. Cole. The kind that burns everything, Bob, including the man holding the torch." Ethan gave a small, tired smile. "Then maybe it's worth getting burned." Outside, the press descended like vultures. Microphones, flashing lights, shouted questions. "Mr. Cole, did you falsify the recordings? Are you seeking reinstatement? Do you regret your actions?" He said nothing, just kept walking through the storm of cameras. Nina pushed through the crowd to reach him. "They're twisting everything," she said breathlessly. "They're saying you doctored the audio, that you fabricated it to get revenge." He kept his eyes on the street ahead. "Let them talk. The truth doesn't need defending. Just time." She frowned. "That's not how the world works, Ethan. Time doesn't save people anymore. Public opinion does." He stopped at the curb, watching the snow melt into the asphalt. "Then let's give them a story they can't rewrite." That night, they met in a diner near the Hudson. The kind that stayed open all night. The kind where no one cared who you were. Ethan laid out files across the booth. Notes, recordings, affidavits. "This isn't over," he said. "Reynolds and his team weren't just fixing one case. They've been laundering verdicts for years, covering up corporate fraud, paying off witnesses, silencing whistleblowers." Nina looked through the documents, disbelief in her voice. "You got all this?" He nodded. "Old contacts, favors. Some people still remember who I used to be." She flipped through a list of names, her expression tightening. "These aren't just lawyers. There are judges here, politicians." "Exactly," she exhaled. "If we go public with this, we're dead. If we don't, they'll keep doing it." The diner's neon sign flickered against the window, bathing them in red and blue light. Outside, a police car rolled past, slow and deliberate. Nina lowered her voice. "You think they're watching us?" "I think they've been watching me since the day I stood up in that courtroom." He packed the files back into the briefcase. "Tomorrow, we go to the Attorney General's office. If we hand this over before the DA's people can intercept it, maybe we stand a chance." Nina hesitated. "And after that?" "After that," he said, "we disappear." The next morning, the streets glistened with new snow. Ethan and Nina moved quickly through the city, briefcase in hand, heads down. They reached the Attorney General's building just after 9, but when they arrived, 2 men in dark suits were already waiting by the entrance. One of them stepped forward, flashing a badge. "Ethan Cole?" Ethan stopped. His heart sank. "You're under arrest for obstruction of justice and unlawful practice of law," the man said. "Please come with us." Nina's eyes widened. "You can't." "It's all right," Ethan said quietly. "Do what you came to do." As they handcuffed him, he looked at her, steady, calm. "Don't lose that file." "I won't," she said. Her voice broke on the last word. The holding cell was cold, the light buzzing faintly overhead. Ethan sat on the narrow cot, his hands clasped, waiting. Hours passed before the door opened. A familiar voice said, "You've made quite the mess, Cole." It was Dana Myers, his old partner, the one who'd once believed in him. She stood outside the cell, immaculate as ever, her expression unreadable. "Dana," he said, "I wondered when you'd show up." She crossed her arms. "You think you've done something noble, but all you've done is drag the system into chaos." "The system was already broken," he replied. "I just held up a mirror." She studied him for a long time. Then, quietly, "They're offering you a deal. Walk away. Leave New York. Stay silent, and they'll drop the charges." Ethan laughed softly. "You really think I'd take that?" "I think you should," she said. "Because if you don't, they'll destroy you. You'll never practice again. You'll be lucky if you can still serve coffee." He looked up at her, his voice steady. "I've already been a waiter, Dana. Turns out I'm good at it." Something flickered in her eyes, pity, maybe even admiration, before she turned away. "You always were a stubborn bastard." 2 days later, he was released on bail. The story had grown larger, more volatile. Public protests outside the courthouse, editorials calling for reform, people demanding answers. Nina met him outside, pale and sleepless, but smiling faintly. "They can't silence it anymore," she said. "It's everywhere now. The documents, the names, the evidence. You started something." He glanced at the headlines plastered on the newsstand beside them. "Corruption scandal expands. Major figures under investigation." "Something," he murmured, almost to himself. "Let's hope it's enough." They walked together down the snowy sidewalk, 2 silhouettes swallowed by the city. The noise of traffic, the pulse of life, the weight of what they'd done all merging into a strange, electric quiet. He didn't know what would happen next, if he'd be imprisoned, or redeemed, or forgotten. But as he glanced at Nina, the wind catching her hair, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't running anymore. Not from his mistakes. Not from justice. Not from himself. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the fear and fatigue, he felt something like peace. The kind of peace that comes when you've finally done the right thing, no matter the cost. That night, in a hotel room overlooking the river, he watched the city's lights ripple across the dark water. He thought about the years he'd wasted, chasing success, drowning guilt, mistaking victory for virtue. Now, stripped of everything, he finally understood what it meant to be free. The door clicked open. Nina stepped inside, holding a newspaper. Her voice was quiet but firm. "The Attorney General's office is reopening 23 cases. They're calling it the Cole investigation." He turned to her, a slow smile breaking across his tired face. Then maybe it was worth it. She sat beside him, handing him the paper. You know they'll still come for you, right? He nodded. Let them. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the hum of the city drifting in through the window. Then Nina said, You could leave. Start over somewhere else. Nobody would blame you. Ethan looked out at the skyline, the jagged silhouette of a city that had broken and remade him all at once. No, he said softly. Not yet. Outside, sirens wailed again, distant, haunting, familiar. But this time they didn't sound like a warning. They sounded like the city breathing. He leaned back, closing his eyes, letting the sound wash over him. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel afraid. Because truth, real, brutal, imperfect truth, had finally spoken louder than power. Snow clung to the edges of Manhattan like a slow-moving ghost. From his hotel window, Ethan watched the city breathe beneath the gray morning sky. Exhaust smoke rising from yellow cabs, the slow rhythm of pedestrians moving through the chill, the pulse of life unbothered by the chaos he had unleashed. The newspaper headlines on the coffee table behind him screamed his name again. The Cole investigation expands. High-profile arrests imminent. Beneath that, a smaller headline. Ex-lawyer remains silent amidst national uproar. He smiled bitterly. Silence. That was the first honest thing anyone had written about him in months. Behind him, the faint sound of footsteps. Nina, wrapped in a wool coat, hair pulled into a messy bun, dark circles under her eyes. She looked exhausted but alive. You didn't sleep, she said. Ethan shook his head. Didn't feel like dreaming. She walked closer, handing him a cup of coffee. They've arrested Porter, she said quietly. The news broke an hour ago. Financial fraud, witness tampering. They're trying to make him the scapegoat. Ethan turned from the window, meeting her eyes. Reynolds? Vanished. The word hung heavy between them. Ethan exhaled, the warmth of the coffee seeping into his hands. Of course he did. Men like Reynolds don't get caught. They dissolve into the cracks they helped create. Unless someone drags them out, Nina replied. Ethan glanced at her, the faintest flicker of a smile crossing his face. You've been spending too much time with me. She shrugged. Someone has to keep you from getting killed. The phone on the nightstand buzzed. Unknown number. Ethan hesitated before answering. Cole? A pause. Then a familiar voice, low and precise. Reynolds. You should have stayed gone, Reynolds said. You think this ends with me in a cell? You've got no idea how deep this runs. Ethan's grip tightened around the phone. Then tell me, Reynolds laughed softly. You still believe in truth. That's your flaw. You think exposure means victory. But the system doesn't break when it's caught, Cole. It adapts. Not this time. Oh, it already has, Reynolds murmured. You just haven't seen it yet. The line went dead. Nina saw the look on Ethan's face. What did he say? He set the phone down slowly. He's not running. He's playing. She frowned. Then we find out what game he's playing. Ethan stared at the city below, the snow melting into gray slush on the streets. He felt the weight of it again. Not fear, not even guilt, but inevitability. The kind of pull that drags a man back into the fire he thought he'd escaped. By noon, the streets around the courthouse were barricaded. Protesters held signs demanding reform. Reporters shouted questions into microphones. The scandal had become a storm. The Cole investigation wasn't just about corruption anymore. It was about the system itself. Ethan and Nina pushed through the crowd, their coats dusted with snow. Inside, the lobby buzzed with federal agents, lawyers, and men in suits who looked like they hadn't slept in days. At the far end of the hall, Dana Myers stood waiting. She looked different, not the unflappable senior partner he'd once admired, but tired, haunted. "You shouldn't be here," she said as he approached. "You said the same thing last time," Ethan replied. "This is different." She handed him a file. Inside were photos, surveillance shots, documents marked confidential, and one image that made Ethan's stomach tighten. Reynolds shaking hands with a state senator, a timestamp from 2 days ago. "He's not gone," Dana said. "He's bargaining. He's offering names, politicians, judges, corporations. He'll give them everything if they let him walk." Ethan stared at the photo. "And they'll take the deal." She didn't answer. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked.
"Because you were right," she said quietly. "We built something rotten, and it's not going to stop until someone cuts the root." Ethan closed the folder. "Then let's do it." Dana hesitated. "Ethan, listen to me. If you go after him now, there's no coming back. He'll take you down with him. You've already lost everything once. Don't do it again." He looked at her, eyes steady. "The first time I lost my name. This time, I might get it back." They drove out of the city as night fell, the skyline dissolving behind them into a smear of silver and gold. Reynolds had been sighted at a private estate in Westchester, one of his client's properties, a fortress disguised as a mansion. The snow turned to freezing rain as they pulled up the long driveway. Lights glowed behind tall windows. Nina parked the car behind a cluster of trees. "You're insane," she whispered. "Probably," Ethan said, pulling his coat tighter. "Stay here." She caught his arm. "If you go in there alone, he'll bury you." He looked at her hand on his sleeve, small, trembling, warm. "If I don't go in, he'll bury everyone else." Then he slipped into the shadows. The rain slicked the stone steps as he climbed. Through the glass, he could see Reynolds inside, sitting by a fireplace, talking to 2 men in dark suits. Ethan recognized one of them immediately, a lobbyist with enough influence to make laws disappear. He waited until the men left. Then he moved. The door wasn't locked. It never was, not for men who thought they owned the world. Reynolds didn't look surprised when Ethan stepped inside. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Ethan shut the door behind him. "You talk too much for a fugitive." Reynolds poured 2 glasses of scotch, offering one. "You still drink?" Ethan ignored it. "You're selling out your partners." Reynolds smirked. "Self-preservation, Cole. You of all people should understand that." "I understand desperation. This isn't that." Reynolds studied him. "You think you're the hero of this story, don't you? The fallen man who rises again. The martyr who exposes the rot. But you're not saving anyone. You're feeding the machine. They'll hang me, rewrite the narrative, and the system will keep turning. You'll just be another headline." Ethan took a step closer. "Maybe. But sometimes one headline is enough to start a fire." Reynolds laughed softly. "You really haven't learned. Truth doesn't burn people like us, Cole. It just makes us expensive." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Then maybe you should start counting the cost." From his coat pocket, he pulled a small recorder and set it on the table. Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "You came to blackmail me?" "I came to finish what you started." He pressed play. The recording began. Their conversation, every word. Reynolds froze. "You son of a—" "Insurance," Ethan said. "You talk, I broadcast. You stay quiet. Maybe the world gets to hear what justice sounds like when it's cornered." Reynolds moved fast, faster than Ethan expected. The scotch glass shattered on the floor as Reynolds lunged, grabbing the recorder. They struggled, the firelight flickering across their faces, shadows twisting on the walls. Ethan hit the table hard. Reynolds's fist caught him across the jaw. The recorder skidded under a chair. "Always so righteous," Reynolds hissed, pinning him down. "You think truth saves anyone? It just gets them killed." Ethan's hand found the broken glass. He swung, not to kill, but to survive. Reynolds stumbled back, clutching his arm, blood mixing with whiskey on the floor. Ethan retrieved the recorder and stood, breath ragged. "You're done." Reynolds laughed weakly. "You think this ends with me bleeding on a rug?" "No," Ethan said. "It ends with you in handcuffs." He walked toward the door. Behind him, Reynolds called out, voice sharp and trembling. "You can't fix it, Cole. The system's bigger than both of us." Ethan stopped, turned slightly. "Then I'll make it smaller." Outside, Nina was waiting. When she saw him, relief and fear crossed her face at once. "You're bleeding." "Just a reminder I'm still alive," he said, slipping the recorder into her hand. "Get this to the press." "What about you?" He looked back toward the mansion, where sirens now wailed in the distance. "I'll buy us time." By dawn, the story broke nationwide. The recording leaked, implicating senators, judges, and corporations. The Cole investigation became the Cole scandal. Reynolds was found unconscious but alive. He would face trial. Ethan, however, had vanished. Some said he fled the country. Others claimed he was in protective custody. But those who knew him, the few who had seen the quiet determination in his eyes, suspected otherwise. Because men like Ethan Cole didn't run. They waited. They rebuilt. They watched from the shadows until the next battle began. Weeks later, in a small town outside Albany, a man with a faded scar along his jaw walked into a diner. He wore a flannel shirt, no tie, no briefcase. The waitress smiled. "You new around here?" He smiled back. "Just passing through." He sat by the window, sipping black coffee, reading a newspaper someone had left behind. The front page read, "Reynolds sentenced. System under review." Ethan folded the paper carefully, watching the snow fall beyond the glass. Somewhere, far away, the city kept moving. The world turned. Justice, imperfect, battered, slow, still breathed. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man running from his past. He felt like a man walking towards something new. Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of sirens again, softer now, like a memory fading into distance. He dropped a few bills on the counter and stood. As he stepped into the cold morning, the light breaking over the frozen trees, he whispered to no one in particular, "Maybe it was worth it after all." And then he walked on, disappearing into the quiet road ahead. The wind had shifted. The last of winter's chill clung to the Hudson, and the river carried it downstream like a lingering secret. Ethan Cole stood on the small pier behind the diner, hands in his pockets, watching the water move. Each ripple reflected a fractured sky, half gray, half gold, as if the world itself couldn't decide whether it was breaking or healing. It had been 6 months since the night at the mansion, 6 months since the recording that changed everything. The city had devoured his name, spit it out, and moved on. But the echo of what he had done hadn't faded. It had spread. The Cole reforms, as the press called them, were being debated in state houses across the country. New oversight committees, transparency protocols, independent review boards. It wasn't perfection, but it was movement. The kind that came from friction, from pain, from truth, dragging itself through the mud and still managing to breathe. He thought often about the irony of it all. He had spent years defending laws he no longer believed in, then lost everything for breaking one that had needed breaking. The system that had destroyed him was now quoting his name in legislation. Maybe that was justice. Maybe it wasn't. Behind him, the screen door creaked. "Coffee?"
Nina's voice carried softly through the cold. He turned and smiled faintly. She stood there in a thick scarf and wool coat, holding 2 steaming cups. The years had changed her, sharpened her presence. The exhaustion that once clung to her eyes had been replaced by something steadier. Resolve. He took the cup from her hand. "You're late." "I had to answer 3 calls before I could leave," she said, rolling her eyes. "Reporters again. They want you to do another interview. Tell them I'm still dead." She laughed quietly. "That line's getting old." "It's still true." They sat together on the edge of the pier, the wood damp and creaking beneath them. Seagulls circled lazily overhead, their cries carried by the wind. "How's the city?" he asked. "Louder," she said. "Messier, but different. People are paying attention now. The DA's office has been purged. Dana's heading the new ethics board." Ethan nodded slowly. "She deserved that." "She mentioned you." He looked at her. "She said," Nina continued, "tell him the system didn't change him. He changed the system." Ethan let out a quiet breath. Dana always did know how to make things sound better than they were. Nina sipped her coffee, watching him from the corner of her eye. "You could come back, you know." "To what?" "To the fight." He smiled, an old, tired smile that held more peace than sorrow. "The fight doesn't need me anymore. It's yours now." She frowned. "That's not fair. You started it." "I lit a match," he said softly. "You're the one who built the fire." The wind picked up, scattering flakes of old snow across the pier. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence between them wasn't heavy. It was full. The kind of silence shared by 2 people who had already said everything that mattered. Finally, Nina broke it. "You really think this is enough? That one case, one scandal can fix it?" Ethan looked out at the river again, his reflection rippling with the current. "No," he said. "Nothing fixes the world. We just push it a little closer to right before we're gone. That's all anyone ever does." She studied him, as if trying to memorize the lines of his face. "You sound like you're saying goodbye." "Maybe I am." "Where will you go?" He shrugged. "Somewhere quiet. Somewhere that doesn't know my name. I hear small towns in Vermont still believe in second chances." "You could stay," she said gently. "There's still work to do." He turned to her, and for the first time in a long time, his eyes softened completely. "You'll do it better than I ever could. You still believe people can change." "And you don't?" "I believe they can choose," he said. "Change is just the word we use when they do it long enough." A gust of wind rattled the pier. The sky had deepened to a bruised orange, the sun dipping low behind the skyline miles away. For a brief moment, the world looked suspended between endings and beginnings. Nina set her empty cup beside her and leaned forward, elbows on her knees. "When I first met you, you terrified me," she said with a half smile. "You were brilliant, impossible, arrogant as hell, but when everything fell apart, you still stood up. That's the part I'll remember." Ethan chuckled quietly. "You make me sound like I knew what I was doing." "You did," she said simply. "You just didn't know it mattered." The light faded. The cold deepened. Somewhere in the distance, the faint hum of a train rolled across the valley. Ethan stood, brushing snow from his coat. "You should head back before it gets dark." "What about you?" He glanced toward the horizon. "I'll catch the next one." She looked at him for a long time, as if deciding whether to say something else. Then she nodded. "You'll call?" "When I find the right number," he said, smiling faintly. Nina stepped forward, hugging him briefly. It was the kind of embrace that said everything words couldn't. Then she pulled away, her eyes glistening but steady. "Goodbye, Ethan." "Goodbye, counselor." He watched as she walked back toward the diner, her figure fading into the pale light until the door closed behind her. The silence that followed wasn't lonely. It was whole. Ethan turned back to the river. The world had quieted. Somewhere beneath the surface, he could hear the faint creak of the city's pulse, still beating, still imperfect, still alive. He thought about the man he had been, the courtroom lion, the drunk, the waiter, the ghost. And now just a man standing between what was broken and what could still be mended. He knelt by the edge of the pier, reaching into his coat pocket. From it, he drew a small, weathered item, his old law license, cracked and faded, the embossed letters barely legible. It had survived everything: the scandal, the fire, the fall. He turned it over in his hand, then smiled. "Rest easy," he whispered, and let it fall into the river. The current took it instantly, spinning it once before pulling it under. For a moment, the water glimmered gold where it had vanished. Then it was gone. He stood there a while longer, watching until the last light disappeared. Then he turned, walking back up the path toward the main road, the crunch of snow beneath his boots steady and deliberate. Each step felt lighter than the last. At the top of the hill, he paused. Across the valley, the city lights flickered faintly like distant stars. He could almost hear it, the faint rumble of the courtroom, the arguments, the laughter, the noise of it all, the world he'd fought and lost and changed. "Maybe this is what justice looks like," he murmured. "Not victory, not defeat, just peace." The wind answered with a soft whisper through the trees. He pulled his coat tighter and began to walk again, the road stretching before him into the fading light. He didn't know where it led. He didn't need to. For the first time in his life, he wasn't chasing anything. He was simply moving forward. Behind him, the river carried his past away piece by piece toward the sea. Ahead, somewhere beyond the horizon, the world waited, not redeemed, not perfect, but ready to begin again. And as the night closed in, Ethan Cole disappeared into it, a man no longer haunted by who he'd been, but at peace with who he had finally become. The city would remember him, in footnotes, in reforms, in whispers between lawyers about the man who broke the rules to save the truth. But the legend would fade, as all legends do. The law would continue. Cases would rise and fall. People would still cheat, lie, win, lose. But somewhere, every now and then, a young attorney would walk into a courtroom and, in the quiet before the first word was spoken, feel a pulse, like a heartbeat in the walls, and they'd remember the name Ethan Cole. Not as a scandal, not as a hero, but as proof that sometimes even broken men can light the way.